In the last presentation, I was talking about God's goodness and God's perfect goodness or infinite goodness. And I was struggling to try to express a little bit about the word good and what it means. Now, I know that McCormick, in his presentation in criticizing the cosmological argument, was probably thinking primarily about moral perfection in the case of God. But I was going back to a prior point, which is the word good, more generally speaking. What does the word good mean? Most fundamentally, for Aquinas, the word good means that which is being as desired. So when I see some reality that is desirable to me, that I mean by that it's a reality that satisfies something in me. And then I moved on from that to make the argument that if, in fact, there is a first cause of all that exists, a first cause, and from that first cause, everything has come, all has come to exist, then that first cause must, as the source of all finite perfections, must be within itself the reason for any perfection, any goodness at all. It is the reason for it. It's the source of it. And because God, the first cause, is unlimited existence, unlimited being, self-existent, unbounded being, and is the source of all goodness, desirability found in the creation, then it follows from that the first cause must be supremely desirable and therefore supremely good. Right? That's the essence of the argument that I was making for the goodness of God. What about moral perfection? Well, moral perfection is another very sticky problem because what we mean by God, there is no, like when we talk about morality, what is morality for God? Well, morality for God is God being fully actualized and good in himself. What does morality mean to us? Morality means for me conforming my life to a set of standards of what would be good for human nature. So for example, if I say it's bad for me to lie to the people that I love, for instance, to lie to the people I love, or to kill innocent human beings, if I say those are morally bad things, those morally bad things are morally bad because they are improper exercises of my nature toward other instances of the human kind. So it would be, for someone that I love, it would be wrong for me to deceive them about something important, or it would be wrong for me to kill them, an innocent person or whatever. Those things would be morally imperfect or morally wrong for me to do. Or let's even use the word evil. They would be evil for me to do. Now, if those things are morally bad or morally imperfect for me to do, it's because I'm a creature that finds myself in a certain relationship to other creatures. In other words, to know what's morally imperfect, like if I were to say if a lion were to kill a bear, I don't say that's moral imperfection, because the bear or the lion don't have any moral obligations toward each other. They're not moral beings. It's an amoral action. Morality only applies to beings that can freely choose, first of all, and who stand in a certain relationship to each other. So for instance, it would be wrong for me to kill another innocent human being because their life is not mine. I didn't give them their life, and it's not mine to take. And so there's a certain inalienability of sorts in the life of the other person and their right to life that my moral action of respecting their life takes into account. Now, obviously this is a very, very complicated issue, talk about the basis of morality. But what I'm saying is that moral decision-making and moral perfection cannot be discussed in the total abstraction from the kind of being that we're talking about. So when we talk about rocks, there is no morality for rocks. When we talk about bears, there is no morality for bears. When we talk about human beings, there is morality because we have certain relationships and obligations toward one another and toward God that we ought to pursue. There are certain virtues that we ought to strive for, wisdom and courage and temperance and so on. There are certain things that we should strive for to perfect our nature and to become more fully what we are called to be by virtue of the powers of our nature. When we talk about God, what standards are imposed upon God's development of virtue? Well, that doesn't even make sense to talk about God's development of virtue. God is infinitely actualized. God is absolutely perfect. God's absolutely complete in his nature. There is nothing more for God to be, no greater perfection for God to achieve in terms of his own actualization. He's perfectly and completely actualized. If he's not, then he's not the first reality. He's moved by something else. So if he's the first reality and completely actualized, then the definition of moral perfection, that is, he is all that he can be. He has purely actualized every moral goodness that can be actualized is present already in God's infinite nature. So to talk about God's moral imperfection is to presuppose that there's some type of external standard to God against which he's to be judged. Quite the opposite is the case, that if God is the first reality and everything else has come from God, God is the source, ultimately, of any standard of moral goodness, but there is no moral standard of goodness to impose upon God externally to him. So what would be happening here in evaluating God in moral terms would be to take human standards of morality and to impose them upon the first reality. That's putting the cart before the horse. That's putting things in the opposite direction. If God is the first, and if there is a moral fabric to the universe at all, if there is even any meaning to morality, it ultimately finds its grounding in the first cause. To have some moral idea that develops along the way that then becomes is used later to impose upon the first cause of its moral goodness seems to me to be opposite of things. Now, there are other ways that we can take to approach this question. For example, we can talk about moral evil as some type of depravity, corruption, imperfection. But none of that makes any sense when applied to the first cause. With the first cause, there's absolute actuality. There's no deprivation, there's no corruption, there's no distortion, there's no lack, there's no motion, there's no potentiality. If there's none of those things, because all of them would suggest motion and incompleteness, none of which is compatible with the first cause, if none of that stuff can apply to the first cause, for reasons that we've already discovered, again, all of this depends upon the discoveries of the argument itself that concluded to a first cause. So if none of those things apply, then the very notion of moral evil or evil in general in terms of the first cause makes no sense at all. Now, what about all the terrible things that happen in this world? What can we infer from those things about the first cause? Well, one thing we can infer about them is that the world itself does not express the infinite perfections of the first cause. In other words, the world is contingently good. It's partially good in the sense that it's changing in its goodness, but it is not equal to the infinite goodness of the first cause. That's number one. Another thing we can draw from it is that, we could ask questions like, why would God make a world in which there is corruption and distortion and imperfection, and also the ability to choose poorly? So, for example, child abuse and all of those things and all the factors involved in that. Why would God let a world exist like that? Well, all of that would lead us into questions about, God's causal relationship to this world. Did God make a world in which everything that happens is like a puppet pulling on strings? Or rather, did God make a world in which there's a type of semi-autonomy in the world that allows beings within it to have responsibility? And for there to be chance events of a sort, events that happen in the world. So, for example, with the development of a mutation or a virus or whatever, that those are things that are possible within the kind of world made by God. Why would God do that? Well, we can talk about ultimately the whole process of history will lead to an ultimately good resolution and an ultimately good end. And we can see that sometimes. We get glimpses of ways in which we can get insights into the goodness that comes even from the tragedies and the difficulties that happen in human life. Now, I'm not wanting to propose that I can in any way come up with explanations of why everything that happens in this world. But the things that do happen are part of a world in which I would argue there is an evolving goodness coming from it, and that we experience on some level within ourselves. But all of this, first of all of this presupposes, if we're going to make moral judgments on God, I think that's based on a huge mistake on many levels. But if we're going to try to do that, if we're going to try to impose some type of moral judgment on God based upon our limited, small experience of the creation, it would seem to me that that is a very precarious move, because the only way that I can make an ultimate judgment on God if that even makes sense to talk about making an ultimate judgment on God. The only way that I could even bother to, or even think that I could come close to making a moral judgment on God would be as if I could see the whole totality of the work that God is doing in this world, in order to make a judgment about whether or not the whole process was worth it, or whether it's good. And I would suggest to you that the whole process may indeed be good. In fact, I believe it will be a good one, a good process, and that God will bring good through the allowance of a world with semi-autonomy that develops in various ways through free acts, through chance events, and so on, which creates the kind of world in which a greater good will come in the end than would have if that had not been allowed. Now, I would just say that Mr. McCormick cannot disprove that possibility, and therefore the argument from evil is certainly not a decisive one, and I think it has various other problems that come along with it. All right, I better stop there, and I'll move to the other objection in the next presentation.